Hello, mystery lovers. How are you all? I hope you're all well. Tell me, if you were home alone on a stormy night and suddenly a strange stranger knocked on your door, what would you do? Open the door or call the police? Today's story begins similarly, but this is no ordinary story. This is a mysterious adventure of Miss Jane Marple, where the line between truth and lies becomes completely blurred. If you like classic mystery stories, please be sure to subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell so you never miss our new stories. So, let's go to England in 1952, where one dark night something is about to happen that will change everyone's life. Chapter 1. The Uninvited Guest. The rain had been falling steadily since tea time, drumming against the windows of Old Hall with the persistence of an unwelcome visitor. Miss Jane Marple sat in her usual armchair by the fire in the drawing-room of her dear friend, Mrs. Constance Hartley, watching the rivulets race down the glass panes. The year was 1952, and autumn had arrived at Greenwood Manor with its customary melancholy. "More tea, Jane?" Constance asked, her hand trembling slightly as she lifted the silver pot. At 73, she was 5 years Miss Marple's senior, though one would hardly know it from her impeccable posture and sharp grey eyes. "Thank you, dear," Miss Marple replied, offering her cup. "Such dreadful weather. It reminds me of the autumn when poor Mrs. Pettigrew's greenhouse collapsed. Do you remember? Though that, of course, proved to be no accident at all." Constance smiled. "Your memory for village incidents is quite remarkable, Jane." Before Miss Marple could respond, a sharp crack of thunder shook the house, followed immediately by the urgent clanging of the front doorbell. Both ladies looked toward the drawing-room door with mild surprise. It was nearly 8 o'clock, and visitors at such an hour were most unusual in the countryside. They heard Morrison, the elderly butler, shuffling across the entrance hall. The heavy oak door creaked open, and a gust of wind carried raised voices into the house. A woman's voice, high and desperate, cut through the storm. "Please, you must help me. He's going to kill me. I know he is." Miss Marple and Mrs. Hartley exchanged glances and rose simultaneously. By the time they reached the entrance hall, Morrison stood helplessly holding the door, while a drenched young woman stumbled inside, her fashionable travelling suit clinging to her frame, her dark hair plastered to her pale face. "My dear child," Constance exclaimed, rushing forward. "Morrison, fetch towels at once." The woman couldn't have been more than 30, with striking features that might have been beautiful had they not been contorted with terror. Her hands shook violently as she clutched a small leather handbag to her chest. "I'm so sorry," she gasped, water pooling on the marble floor beneath her feet. "I saw the lights from the road. My car. It broke down about a mile back. I had to walk and I—" She broke off, casting a fearful glance back toward the still-open door. "Come now," Miss Marple said gently, her voice carrying the soothing authority of a village schoolmistress. "You're quite safe here. Let us get you dry and warm, and then you can tell us everything." The woman allowed herself to be led into the drawing-room, where Morrison had already stoked the fire to a roaring blaze. As Constance wrapped her in towels and a thick woolen blanket, Miss Marple studied their unexpected guest with the quiet attention she might give to an unusual specimen in her garden. "What is your name, my dear?" Constance asked. "Vivian," the woman replied, her teeth chattering. "Vivian Ashcroft, Mrs. Vivian Ashcroft." "And who is it you believe wishes you harm?" Miss Marple inquired, her tone conversational, as though discussing the weather rather than murder. Vivian's eyes, a peculiar shade of violet, filled with tears. "My husband, Gerald. We had a terrible row this evening at the inn where we were staying, the Golden Pheasant, about 5 miles north. He's been different lately, cold and calculating. Tonight, he said—" She swallowed hard. "He said accidents happen all of the time in the country. That a woman might wander off in a storm and never be found." "How perfectly dreadful," Constance murmured, pouring a generous measure of brandy into a glass. "Drink this, dear." As Vivian accepted the glass with shaking hands, Miss Marple noted several curious details. The woman's expensive clothes, the faint mark on her ring finger where a wedding band had recently been removed, and most intriguingly, the way her eyes kept darting to the windows, as if expecting to see a face pressed against the glass. "I think," Miss Marple said quietly, "that you had better tell us everything from the beginning, Mrs. Ashcroft. And perhaps we should telephone the police." "No!" Vivian's response was sharp and immediate. "No police, not yet. You don't understand. Gerald has connections. He'll make it seem as though I'm mad, that I'm the one who's dangerous." She leaned forward, her voice dropping to barely more than a whisper. "But I'm not mad, I assure you. I'm perfectly sane, and I know that my husband is planning to murder me." Outside, the rain continued its relentless assault on the windows, and somewhere in the darkness, if Vivian Ashcroft was to be believed, a killer waited for his opportunity. Miss Marple exchanged another glance with Constance. She had encountered many such situations in St. Mary Mead, and experience had taught her that the truth was rarely as simple as it first appeared. "Very well," she said, "no police for now. But you must tell us everything, Mrs. Ashcroft. Every detail, no matter how small or seemingly insignificant." As Vivian began her tale, Miss Marple settled back in her chair, her knitting needles clicking softly. A sound that many in St. Mary Mead had learned meant that Miss Marple's formidable mind was very much at work indeed. Chapter 2. The Widow's Tale. Vivian Ashcroft's hands had steadied somewhat after the brandy, though her eyes remained restless, darting between her two elderly hostesses like a cornered animal seeking escape routes. Miss Marple's knitting needles maintained their gentle rhythm as she waited, patient as a spider in its web. "We were married only 8 months ago," Vivian began, her voice stronger now. "In London, at St. Margaret's. Gerald swept me off my feet. He was everything a woman could want. Handsome, wealthy, attentive. Perhaps too attentive, I should have realized." Mrs. Hartley poured fresh tea, the delicate china cups clinking softly. "Too attentive, my dear. He wouldn't let me out of his sight. At first, I thought it romantic. He cancelled my subscriptions to ladies' clubs, discouraged visits from my friends, said he wanted me all to himself." Vivian's laugh was bitter. "I was a fool, a vain, stupid fool." Miss Marple's needles paused for the briefest moment. "You mentioned a row at the Golden Pheasant. What brought you to this part of the country?" "A holiday," Gerald said. "A chance to escape London's bustle. But I think now he planned it all carefully. The isolation, the distance from anyone who knew me." Vivian's fingers clutched the blanket tighter. 3 days ago, I overheard a telephone conversation. Gerald was speaking to someone, a woman, I think, about insurance policies, my insurance policies. He didn't know I was listening outside his study door." "What exactly did he say?" Miss Marple inquired, her blue eyes sharp as flint behind her spectacles. "He said, 'Once it's done, we'll have everything. The policies mature in full, and no one will ask questions about an accident. These country roads are treacherous in autumn.' Then he laughed. Such a cold laugh. Vivian shuddered. When I confronted him tonight, he denied everything. Told me I was imagining things, that the country air was making me hysterical. But I saw his face change, saw the calculation in his eyes. Morrison appeared at the door. "Excuse me, madam. The telephone lines appear to be down. The storm, I suspect." "Thank you, Morrison," Mrs. Hartley replied. "That will be all for now." As the butler withdrew, Miss Marple observed, "How convenient that your car broke down precisely near this house, Mrs. Ashcroft." Vivian's head snapped up. "You don't believe me. You think I'm making this up." "On the contrary," Miss Marple said mildly, "I believe something has frightened you terribly. Whether it is precisely what you think it is remains to be seen. Tell me, when did you remove your wedding ring?" The colour drained from Vivian's face. Her hand instinctively went to her bare finger. How did you— There's a distinct mark. And you've been rubbing the spot unconsciously since you arrived. The ring was removed recently, within the last hour or two, I should say. "I threw it at him," Vivian whispered. "During our argument, it rolled under the bureau, and I left it there. I wanted nothing more to do with Gerald Ashcroft, or his cursed marriage." Mrs. Hartley leaned forward. "My dear Jane, surely we must do something. The poor child is clearly in distress." "Indeed," Miss Marple agreed. "Mrs. Ashcroft, do you have family? People who would wonder at your absence?" "No. My parents died 5 years ago. I have a cousin in Edinburgh, but we haven't spoken in years. That's what made me so vulnerable, you see. Gerald knew I was alone in the world." A sudden sound made all three women freeze. The distinct crunch of footsteps on the gravel drive, barely audible beneath the rain's percussion. Morrison's voice could be heard in the entrance hall, and then a man's voice, deep and authoritative. "I'm looking for my wife, Vivian Ashcroft. Her car broke down on the road, and I've been searching for her. This was the only house with lights on for miles." Vivian's face turned ashen. "It's him," she breathed. "He's found me." Miss Marple set down her knitting with deliberate calm. "Mrs. Hartley, I think we should invite Mr. Ashcroft in for tea, don't you? It would be most interesting to meet him." "Jane, you can't— My dear Constance, if Mr. Ashcroft means his wife harm, he can hardly do so with witnesses present. And if he doesn't—" Miss Marple's eyes gleamed. "Well, then we shall learn a great deal more about this situation." Before anyone could protest further, the drawing-room door opened. Morrison stood aside, and a man entered, tall, impeccably dressed despite the rain, with dark hair silvered at the temples and a face that might have been carved from marble. He was perhaps 45, distinguished and urbane, and his eyes, when they fell upon Vivian, showed nothing but concern. "Thank God," he breathed. "Darling, I've been out of my mind with worry." He moved toward her, hands outstretched. "Stay away from me." Vivian shrank back against the sofa. Gerald Ashcroft stopped, bewilderment crossing his features. He turned to the two older women with an apologetic smile. "Forgive me, ladies. I'm Gerald Ashcroft. My wife has been unwell lately. The doctors say it's her nerves. She has these episodes, imagines things that aren't real." His voice was honey smooth, tinged with just the right amount of husbandly concern. Miss Marple studied him with the same intensity she might give to a particularly complex crossword puzzle. "How fortunate that you found her, Mr. Ashcroft. Do sit down and have some tea. You must tell us all about these episodes." As Gerald Ashcroft settled into a chair, his wet coat steaming slightly in the fire's warmth, Miss Marple caught the flicker of something in his eyes. Satisfaction, perhaps, or triumph. She picked up her knitting once more, but her mind was racing. Someone in this room was lying. The question was, who, and more importantly, why? Outside, the rain continued to fall, and Miss Marple reflected that rain, like tears, could hide a multitude of sins. Chapter 3. A Question of Sanity. The atmosphere in the drawing-room had grown thick with unspoken tensions. Gerald Ashcroft sat with the easy confidence of a man accustomed to being believed, his teacup balanced perfectly on his knee. Vivian remained huddled in her corner of the sofa, the blanket wrapped around her shoulders like armour. "You must forgive my wife," Gerald said, addressing Mrs. Hartley with practised charm. "The doctors at Harley Street have been most concerned. Dr. Pemberton suggested this country holiday might calm her nerves, but I fear it has had rather the opposite effect." "Dr. Pemberton of Harley Street?" Miss Marple inquired innocently, her needles clicking. "Would that be Dr. Edmund Pemberton? Such a distinguished physician. I believe my nephew Raymond consulted him once about his lumbago." No, Dr. Charles Pemberton. Perhaps a cousin?" Gerald's smile didn't waver, but Miss Marple noticed the slight tightening around his eyes. "Perhaps," Miss Marple agreed pleasantly. "Though I could have sworn Edmund was the only Pemberton practising in Harley Street. But then, my memory isn't what it was. Mrs. Ashcroft, how long have you been under Dr. Pemberton's care?" Vivian looked up sharply. "I've never seen any Dr. Pemberton. Gerald is lying. Darling, please." Gerald's voice carried a warning wrapped in silk. "You know the doctor recommended you not become agitated. Remember what happened at the Hendersons' dinner party?" "What happened at the Hendersons' dinner party?" Mrs. Hartley asked, genuinely curious. Gerald sighed heavily. "Vivian accused Lady Henderson of trying to poison her soup. It was most embarrassing. The poor woman was devastated. We haven't been invited anywhere since." "That's not what happened." Vivian's voice rose. "I told you I saw Lady Henderson whispering with you in the library, planning something. You told her about the insurance. You see." Gerald turned to his audience, spreading his hands in a gesture of helplessness. "These delusions have become increasingly elaborate. She believes everyone is conspiring against her." Miss Marple set down her knitting and fixed Gerald with a look that had once made the vicar confess to borrowing church funds for the races. "Mr. Ashcroft, you mentioned searching for your wife after her car broke down. Might I ask how you knew where to look? This is rather an isolated stretch of road." For the first time, Gerald's composure flickered. I followed the road from the Golden Pheasant. It seemed the logical direction. In the dark, in this storm, most remarkable." Miss Marple's tone remained mild, but her eyes were sharp as pins. "And the Golden Pheasant? You're staying there together?" "Yes, for the past 3 days." "Curious," Miss Marple mused. "You see, I happen to know the proprietor, Mr. Jessup. His sister attends the same church as my great-niece in Much Benham. Small world, isn't it? I do hope you found the accommodations comfortable." Gerald's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Quite comfortable, thank you." "The rooms there are rather small, I understand, but cosy for a married couple, I'm sure." "We took separate rooms," Gerald said stiffly. "Given Vivian's condition, I thought it best she have her own space." "How considerate." Miss Marple picked up her knitting again. "Mrs. Ashcroft, forgive me for asking, but had you packed a bag when you left the inn this evening?" Vivian clutched her small handbag. "No, I just ran. I took only this, my handbag with my documents and some money." "Very sensible. One should always keep important documents close." Miss Marple paused. "What sort of documents, if you don't mind my asking?" "My passport, my birth certificate, my mother's jewellery, the few pieces Gerald hadn't convinced me to sell." Vivian's voice was bitter. "He said we needed the money for investments." Gerald stood abruptly. "This is ridiculous. Vivian, you're coming back to the inn with me. These kind ladies have been more than hospitable, but we've imposed enough. I won't go with you." Vivian pressed herself further into the sofa. "You will do as you're told." Gerald took a step forward, and for just an instant the mask of the concerned husband slipped. What lay beneath was something cold and calculating. "Mr. Ashcroft." Mrs. Hartley's voice, though quavering slightly, held firm. "I think it best if Mrs. Ashcroft remains here tonight. The storm is worsening, and the poor dear is exhausted. Surely another night apart won't matter." Gerald's hands clenched into fists, then deliberately relaxed. The charming smile returned, but it no longer reached his eyes. "Of course, how thoughtless of me. Vivian, darling, I'll return for you in the morning. We can sort all this out then, perhaps with Dr. Pemberton present if the telephone lines are restored." "Most sensible," Miss Marple agreed. "Morrison will show you out, Mr. Ashcroft. Do be careful on the roads. They can be so treacherous in weather like this." The emphasis on the word treacherous was slight, but unmistakable. Gerald's eyes met Miss Marple's, and something passed between them. An acknowledgement, perhaps, that the game was now truly afoot. After Gerald had departed, his footsteps crunching away into the stormy night, Vivian burst into tears. "You believe me now, don't you? You saw his face. You saw what he really is." "I saw a man who doesn't like having his plans disrupted," Miss Marple said thoughtfully. "Mrs. Hartley, I think we should make up the blue bedroom for Mrs. Ashcroft, and perhaps Morrison might check that all the doors and windows are properly secured." "You think he'll come back?" Vivian whispered. "I think, my dear, that we have not yet heard the whole truth from anyone tonight. But don't worry, you're quite safe here. Mrs. Hartley and I are rather more formidable than we appear." As Constance led the exhausted Vivian upstairs, Miss Marple returned to the window. The rain had lessened slightly, and in the darkness beyond the glass, she could just make out the shape of a man standing beneath the old oak tree, watching the house. Gerald Ashcroft had not left, after all. Miss Marple smiled grimly. She had encountered his type before. In St. Mary Mead, they came in all guises. The grocer's assistant who embezzled funds, the seemingly devoted son who hastened his mother's death for an inheritance, the respected solicitor who forged wills. But whether Gerald Ashcroft was a would-be murderer, or whether Vivian was something else entirely, a con artist perhaps, or a genuinely disturbed woman, remained to be seen. The truth, Miss Marple reflected, was like rain on a window. Clear enough if you looked at it from the right angle, but easily obscured by one's own reflections. And somewhere in this house, she was certain, there would soon be blood on the floor. Chapter 4. Midnight Discoveries. Miss Marple had never been one to sleep soundly when puzzles remained unsolved. At midnight, she found herself fully dressed, seated in the armchair by her bedroom window, watching the grounds below. The rain had finally stopped, leaving the world glistening and dark under a cloud-obscured moon. The figure beneath the oak tree had vanished an hour ago, but Miss Marple's unease had not. She had learned through decades of observing human nature in St. Mary Mead that the most dangerous moments often came in the small hours when people believed themselves unobserved. A faint sound caught her attention. The soft creak of a floorboard in the corridor outside. Miss Marple rose silently and opened her door a crack. In the dim light of the wall sconces, she could see a figure moving stealthily toward the staircase. It was Vivian Ashcroft, still dressed, carrying her handbag and a pair of shoes. The young woman was leaving. Miss Marple waited until Vivian had descended the stairs before following, her own footsteps practiced and quiet. She had tracked many a suspicious character through St. Mary Mead. The poacher who wasn't really poaching. The maid who was systematically robbing her employer. This was no different. She reached the entrance hall just in time to see Vivienne slip through the front door, leaving it slightly ajar. Miss Marple followed, grateful for the thick carpet that muffled her steps. Outside, the night air was cold and damp, smelling of wet earth and autumn leaves. Vivian was moving quickly across the lawn, heading not toward the road, but toward the small folly at the edge of Mrs. Hartley's property, a decorative stone structure built in the last century, now overgrown with ivy and largely forgotten. Miss Marple followed at a discreet distance, using the shadows of the trees for cover. As she drew closer to the folly, she heard voices, low and urgent. "Told you not to come here," Vivian was saying. "If anyone sees us, no one will see us." The voice was male, but it wasn't Gerald Ashcroft's cultured tones. This voice was younger, rougher. "Did you get it?" "Of course I got it." There was the sound of papers rustling. "But I'm telling you, that old woman suspects something. The way she was asking questions. Then we move faster than planned. Tomorrow night, not next week." Miss Marple edged closer, peering through a gap in the ivy. In the folly's interior, illuminated by a small electric torch, she could see Vivienne standing close to a man, handsome in a coarse way, perhaps 30 years old, wearing a chauffeur's uniform. "Gerald will be at the house in the morning," Vivian said. "You're sure the plan will work?" "Trust me, Viv. I've thought of everything. The telegram will arrive at 10 o'clock, supposedly from his solicitor. Gerald will have to go to London on the noon train. It's a 4-hour journey there and back. That gives us the whole afternoon." The man grinned. "By the time he returns, the old lady will have had her accident, and you'll have played the terrified witness perfectly. Gerald will be the obvious suspect. Everyone at the Golden Pheasant heard you two rowing, and with him conveniently away when it happens. But what about the other old woman, Mrs. Hartley? She'll be visiting her sister in Bath. I arranged for a telegram to reach her, too, saying her sister's taken ill. Morrison's old and half-deaf. He won't be a problem." Vivian laughed softly. "You think of everything, don't you, Bobby? That's why we make such a good team." Bobby pulled her close. "Once this is done, we'll have the old lady's jewellery. Morrison told me she keeps a fortune in that bedroom safe, plus whatever cash we can find. Then we disappear, and Gerald Ashcroft goes to the gallows for murder." "It couldn't happen to a nicer man," Vivian said bitterly. "He really did think I was some weak little thing he could control. The fool actually believed I loved him." "Did you take his money like I told you?" "Every penny from the joint account yesterday. It's safely deposited under my maiden name in Portsmouth. He doesn't even know yet." Vivian's voice was triumphant. "By tomorrow evening, we'll be on a boat to France, and Gerald will be explaining to the police why his insane wife murdered an old woman during one of her episodes." Miss Marple had heard enough. She began to back away carefully, her mind racing through the implications. But in her haste, her foot caught on a tree root, and she stumbled, grabbing at a low branch for support. The branch snapped with a crack that seemed to echo across the silent grounds. "What was that?" Bobby's voice was sharp with alarm. "Someone's there!" Vivian hissed. Miss Marple abandoned stealth for speed, hurrying back toward the house as quickly as her elderly legs would carry her. Behind her, she could hear running footsteps. The folly was closer to the house than she'd realized in the dark, but her pursuers were younger and faster. She'd nearly reached the front door when a hand grabbed her shoulder. She spun to face Bobby, his expression murderous in the moonlight that had finally broken through the clouds. "Well, well," he said softly, tightening his grip. "The nosy old bird. Vivian, looks like we need to change our plans." "Let me go at once, young man," Miss Marple said with all the authority of a village schoolmistress. "I shall scream, and Morrison will hear me." "Morrison's deaf as a post, and you know it," Vivian said, appearing beside Bobby. Her face, so frightened earlier, was now cold and calculating. "We can't let her raise the alarm, Bobby. We have to—" "Have to what?" A new voice interrupted. Mrs. Hartley stepped out from behind a nearby hedge, and to Miss Marple's astonishment, she was holding a very businesslike shotgun. "I believe you were about to suggest something unwise, Mrs. Ashcroft. Or should I say Miss Vivian Cartwright? That is your real name, isn't it?" Bobby released Miss Marple and took a step back, raising his hands. Vivian's face had gone pale. "How did you—" she began. "No." Mrs. Hartley's voice was steady. "I didn't, not until this moment. But Jane signaled me from her window. We have our own code, you see." She held up 3 fingers and pointed toward the folly. "I understood perfectly. While she followed you, I telephoned the police station in the village. They should be arriving shortly, storm damage to the roads permitting." "You couldn't have telephoned," Vivian said desperately. "The lines are down." "Are they?" Miss Marple said mildly, rubbing her shoulder where Bobby had grabbed her. "How curious. Morrison didn't mention anything about downed lines to me. Almost as if someone had disconnected the telephone in the entrance hall to support a story about being unable to call for help." Vivian's face crumpled. Bobby made a sudden movement toward Mrs. Hartley, but the shotgun raised an inch, and he froze. "I wouldn't," Mrs. Hartley said calmly. "I may be old, but I grew up in Kenya, and I assure you, I know how to use this." In the distance, the sound of a motorcar engine could be heard approaching, and then the distinctive bell of a police vehicle. "It's over," Miss Marple said quietly. "Though I must say, you played your part quite well, Miss Cartwright. The terrified wife was almost believable. You should have stuck to the theatre instead of crime." As the police car swept up the drive, its headlamps illuminating the frozen tableau, Miss Marple reflected that this was not quite the conclusion she had expected. The night, it seemed, had more revelations yet to offer. And somewhere in the darkness, Gerald Ashcroft was still out there, unaware that his wife's betrayal ran far deeper than he could have imagined. Chapter 5. The husband, Secret Inspector Craddock, of the county police was a methodical man in his late 40s, with the patient demeanour of someone who had learned that rushing to conclusions led only to trouble. He sat in Mrs. Hartley's drawing room at 1:30 in the morning, his notebook open, listening to Miss Marple's account of the evening's events. "Most extraordinary," he murmured, glancing at Vivian Cartwright, who sat handcuffed between 2 constables, her earlier elegance replaced by sullen defiance. Bobby had been taken away in a separate vehicle, protesting his innocence to the last. Miss Marple, you say you suspected Miss Cartwright from the beginning? Not suspected exactly, Miss Marple corrected gently, but certain details troubled me. The wedding ring removed so recently, yet she claimed to have thrown it at her husband hours earlier. The mark on her finger was fresh, perhaps 30 minutes old when I first observed it. She'd removed it before arriving here, not during an argument at the inn. What else? Inspector Craddock's pencil was poised. Her expensive clothes, yet she spoke of Gerald forcing her to sell her mother's jewellery for investments. A woman in genuine financial distress doesn't wear a suit from Worth of Paris. And then there was the matter of the insurance policies. What about them? She claimed to have overheard Gerald discussing her insurance policies 3 days ago. But insurance policies don't mature in full upon death immediately. There are waiting periods, investigations. Any woman of means would know that. It suggested she'd learned about insurance fraud from books rather than experience. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. Rather like someone who'd learned to pick locks from detective novels, but had never actually tried it with a real door. Vivian's jaw clenched, but she said nothing. "And the car breaking down?" the inspector asked. "There was no car," Miss Marple said simply. "I examined the drive and the road beyond after the police arrived. No tyre tracks anywhere near the house except those of Mr. Ashcroft's vehicle. She walked here deliberately, having gotten herself soaked somehow, probably by standing in the rain for a few minutes before ringing the bell." Inspector Craddock nodded approvingly. "Well reasoned, but what I don't understand is Mr. Ashcroft's role in all this. Is he victim or accomplice?" As if in answer, there came a sharp knock at the door, and Morrison ushered in Gerald Ashcroft himself. He looked dishevelled now, his earlier polish tarnished by anxiety. His eyes immediately found Vivian. "I knew it," he said hoarsely. "I knew something was wrong. That's why I stayed, watching the house." He turned to Inspector Craddock. "I'm Gerald Ashcroft. I believe you'll want to speak with me." "Indeed, sir. Perhaps you'd care to explain your relationship with this woman." Gerald sank into a chair, suddenly looking much older than his 45 years. "We were married 8 months ago, as she told you. But I'm afraid I wasn't entirely truthful earlier this evening when I claimed she was mentally unstable." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "The truth is far more complicated." "Go on," Miss Marple encouraged, her knitting appearing in her hands as if by magic. "I'm a private detective," Gerald said quietly. "Or I was, before I retired last year. I specialized in cases of fraud and confidence tricks. Vivian, or whatever her real name is, came to my attention 6 months before our marriage. She was suspected of defrauding an elderly gentleman in Bath, but there wasn't enough evidence to prosecute." Vivian's head snapped up. "You lying?" "Quiet," Inspector Craddock ordered. "Continue, Mr. Ashcroft." "I decided to investigate her myself. I cultivated her acquaintance, courted her, married her, all to gather evidence. I thought I could prove she was working with accomplices, running a systematic operation targeting wealthy older people." Gerald's voice was bitter, but she was cleverer than I anticipated. She played the role of devoted wife perfectly, and I began to doubt my own conclusions, until 3 days ago. "What happened 3 days ago?" Mrs. Hartley asked. "I found letters in her room. She thought I was out shooting, correspondence with a man called Robert Finch, Bobby. They were planning something here in this district. I couldn't make out all the details, but I understood enough. They were targeting someone with jewellery, someone elderly and vulnerable." He looked at Mrs. Hartley. "I had no idea it was you until tonight." So the argument at the Golden Pheasant? Miss Marple inquired. Staged by me. I wanted to frighten her into making a mistake, to force her hand. I pretended to be the villainous husband she could paint me as, hoping she'd run to her accomplice, and I could catch them together. Instead, she ran here. Gerald's laugh was hollow. She's brilliant, I'll give her that. She turned my own trap against me, making herself the victim and me the villain. Inspector Craddock studied Gerald carefully. You have proof of your identity as a detective. In my wallet. Credentials, references from the Metropolitan Police, cases I've worked on. Gerald produced the documents. You can telephone Scotland Yard to verify, though I understand the lines were supposedly down. His glance at Vivian was sharp. The inspector examined the papers, then nodded slowly. These appear genuine. I'll verify them tomorrow. He turned to Vivian. Anything to say for yourself, miss? Vivian's facade cracked at last. He married me under false pretenses. He used me, spied on me, while you plotted to frame me for murder and rob an innocent woman, Gerald interrupted coldly. Tell me, Vivian, how many others have there been? How many elderly victims has Bobby helped you rob? Her silence was answer enough. Miss Marple set down her knitting. Inspector, I believe you'll find that if you investigate Miss Cartwright's background, you'll discover a pattern. The elderly gentleman in Bath was probably not her first victim. There was something practiced about her performance tonight. The calculated hysteria. The specific details designed to elicit sympathy. She's done this before. The Hendersons' dinner party, Mrs. Hartley said suddenly. Gerald mentioned it, Vivian accusing Lady Henderson of poisoning her soup. Was that real? Gerald shook his head. There is no Lady Henderson. I invented her to see how you would react, Miss Marple. Your expression told me you'd caught the inconsistency. Indeed, Miss Marple agreed. There are no Hendersons of any note in the social register. A small test, perhaps, to see if we were paying attention. Precisely. Gerald allowed himself a small smile. You're quite formidable, Miss Marple. Vivian was right to fear you. Inspector Craddock stood, closing his notebook. Miss Cartwright, you're under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder and robbery. Mr. Ashcroft, I'll need you to come to the station tomorrow to give a full statement. Miss Marple, Mrs. Hartley, I apologize for this disturbance. You've both been remarkably brave. As the constables led Vivian away, she cast one last venomous look at Gerald. You think you've won? She hissed. But you don't know everything. You don't know about— That's enough, one of the constables said firmly, steering her toward the door. After they had gone, an uneasy silence fell over the drawing room. Gerald stood by the fireplace, staring into the dying embers. Mr. Ashcroft, Miss Marple said quietly, what was it that Vivian was about to reveal? What don't you know about? Gerald's face was pale. I wish I knew, Miss Marple. That's what frightens me. He turned to face them. This case isn't over. Vivian was working with Bobby, yes, but I believe there's someone else, someone we haven't identified yet. Someone who planned this entire operation. What makes you think so? Mrs. Hartley asked. Because Vivian isn't clever enough to have devised all this alone. The fake identity, the background story, the knowledge of which houses to target, it requires resources, connections, inside information. Gerald's voice was grim. Someone told her about you, Mrs. Hartley. Someone who knew you had valuable jewellery and lived in relative isolation. Someone local, perhaps. Miss Marple's needles had resumed their steady rhythm. Inspector Craddock will investigate, I'm sure. But, Mr. Ashcroft, might I suggest you remain in the area for a few more days? I have a feeling this puzzle has more pieces than we've yet discovered. I intend to, Gerald assured her. If there's a third conspirator. I want to find them before they disappear." As he departed into the night, promising to return in the morning, Miss Marple gazed thoughtfully out the window. The rain had started again, gentle now, washing away the footprints in the garden. "Jane," Mrs. Hartley said, "do you believe him? About being a detective?" "Oh, yes," Miss Marple replied. "His credentials will check out, I'm certain. But that doesn't mean he's told us everything." She paused. "There's something else troubling me, Constance. Something Vivian said in the Folly." "What was it?" "She said Gerald was a fool who believed she loved him." "But her tone when she said it?" Miss Marple frowned. "It wasn't entirely convincing. Almost as if she were trying to convince herself as much as Bobby." "You think she actually had feelings for him?" "I think," Miss Marple said slowly, "that the human heart is more complicated than any detective story. And I think that before this is over, we shall see blood on the floor yet." Chapter 6. The morning after dawn broke grey and cheerless over Greenwood Manor. Miss Marple had managed perhaps 2 hours of sleep, but her mind was too active for rest. She dressed carefully in her sensible tweeds and made her way downstairs, where she found Morrison already laying out breakfast in the dining room. "Good morning, Morrison," she said pleasantly. "You're up early." The elderly butler's hands trembled slightly as he arranged the silverware. "Couldn't sleep, miss. All that commotion last night. In 40 years of service at Greenwood Manor, I've never seen the like. Quite understandable. Morrison, if you don't mind my asking, how long have you known Mrs. Hartley?" "Since she was Miss Constance Pemberton, miss. I came into service with the family when I was just a lad of 16. That would be 54 years ago this November." "Pemberton," Miss Marple repeated thoughtfully. "The same name as the doctor Mr. Ashcroft mentioned, Charles Pemberton of Harley Street." Morrison's face brightened. "Oh, that would be Master Charles, Mrs. Hartley's younger brother. He went into medicine, he did. Made quite a name for himself in London." Miss Marple's knitting needles, which she'd brought down with her, paused mid-stitch. "How very interesting. I don't suppose he visits often." "Not as often as Mrs. Hartley would like, I'm sure. But he was here just a fortnight ago. Stayed 3 days, he did." "Was he indeed?" Miss Marple resumed her knitting, her mind racing. "And did he mention anything about his medical practice? Any interesting patients?" Morrison frowned, trying to remember. "Now that you mention it, miss, I did overhear him on the telephone once. He was in the library and I was bringing in the tea. He was talking about a young woman, a patient, I presumed. Said something about the Cartwright case and how it was proving more complicated than expected." The needles stopped again. "Cartwright? You're quite certain?" "Oh, yes, miss. I remember thinking it was an unusual name." Before Miss Marple could probe further, Mrs. Hartley entered, looking pale and exhausted. "Jane, you should have slept longer. After last night. My dear Constance, I've been thinking. Your brother, Dr. Charles Pemberton. When exactly did he visit you?" Mrs. Hartley blinked in surprise at the question. 2 weeks ago." "Why?" "He came to check on my health. I'd been having trouble with my heart, and he insisted on examining me himself rather than trusting the local physician." "And during his visit, did you mention your jewellery to him? The pieces you keep in your bedroom safe?" Constance's face went pale. Yes, I did. He was asking about my financial situation, ensuring I had adequate resources. I told him about the jewellery, my mother's collection, worth quite a considerable sum. He suggested I might consider selling some pieces, but I refused, They have sentimental value." She sat down heavily. "Jane, you can't possibly think—" "I think," Miss Marple said carefully, "that we need to speak with Gerald Ashcroft immediately. Morrison, is there a telephone directory available?" "In the library, miss." 20 minutes later, Gerald Ashcroft arrived, having stayed the night at the Golden Pheasant. He looked considerably more worn than he had the previous evening, dark circles under his eyes betraying his sleepless night. "Miss Marple, you said it was urgent? Mr. Ashcroft, yesterday you mentioned a Dr. Charles Pemberton of Harley Street. You claimed he was treating your wife for her nervous condition. But there is no Dr. Charles Pemberton in Harley Street, is there?" Gerald's expression shifted, becoming guarded. "No. I made up the name to see if anyone would contradict me. It was a test." "But you chose that specific name for a reason, didn't you? Because you knew of a real Dr. Charles Pemberton, Mrs. Hartley's brother." The silence in the room was absolute. Gerald's face had gone very still. "How did you—" "No." Miss Marple set down her knitting. "Because the pieces finally fit together. You're investigating Vivian Cartwright, you claim. But how did you know she would come to this specific house? How did you know to be staying at the Golden Pheasant, which is the closest inn to Greenwood Manor?" "I followed her from London." "No, Mr. Ashcroft, you were already here. You were waiting for her, because you knew this was the target." Miss Marple's voice was gentle, but inexorable. "Dr. Pemberton is involved, isn't he? He's the third conspirator." Mrs. Hartley gasped. "That's impossible. Charles would never—" "I'm afraid," Gerald said quietly, his shoulders sagging, "that Miss Marple is correct. I've been investigating Dr. Charles Pemberton for 3 months. He's deeply in debt, gambling debts primarily. He's been providing information to criminals like Vivian Cartwright about wealthy patients and their relatives. In exchange, he receives a percentage of whatever they steal." "But why didn't you tell us this last night?" Mrs. Hartley demanded, her voice breaking. "He's my brother." "Because I have no proof," Gerald admitted. "Only suspicions and circumstantial evidence. Vivian refused to implicate him. She's loyal to her accomplices, I'll give her that. And Bobby knows nothing. He's merely the hired muscle. Without Pemberton making a mistake or confessing, I can't touch him." "But if he learns that Vivian and Bobby have been arrested," Miss Marple said, "he'll flee, disappear before you can gather your evidence." "Precisely. That's why I said nothing to the police last night. I need to catch him in the act, doing something that proves his involvement beyond doubt." Mrs. Hartley stood abruptly, her face white with anger and grief. "My own brother! Planning to rob me, perhaps worse. How could he?" "Debt makes desperate men of us all," Gerald said, not unkindly. "Mrs. Hartley, I'm truly sorry, but we may be able to use this situation to our advantage." "How?" Miss Marple asked. "Dr. Pemberton doesn't know yet that Vivian and Bobby are in custody. The arrests happened late last night, and Inspector Craddock agreed to keep it quiet until this morning's papers. If we can convince Pemberton that the plan is still active, that Vivian is still here at the house, we can catch him when he comes for his share," Miss Marple finished. "But surely he wouldn't come himself. He'd send Bobby." "Not if we tell him that Bobby has been injured, that Vivian needs his help urgently. A medical emergency would give him the perfect excuse to visit his sister." Gerald's eyes were hard. He's arrogant enough to believe he can't be caught. That's his weakness. Morrison cleared his throat from the doorway. "Excuse me, madam, but there's a gentleman at the door. Dr. Pemberton. He says he heard about the disturbance last night and came to ensure you were unharmed." The three exchanged sharp glances. Gerald moved quickly to the window and peered out. "That's his Bentley. He came alone. He's here to check on his investment," Miss Marple said grimly, "to see if Vivian succeeded." "What do we do?" Mrs. Hartley asked, her voice trembling. Gerald's jaw set. "We let him in. We tell him nothing about the arrests. And we watch him very, very carefully. Miss Marple, are you willing to help?" "My dear boy," Miss Marple said, picking up her knitting once more. "I've been helping since the moment that young woman rang the doorbell. Morrison, please show Dr. Pemberton in. And do mention that Mrs. Ashcroft is resting upstairs, exhausted from her ordeal." As Morrison departed, Miss Marple positioned herself by the window, her knitting needles clicking steadily. But her eyes were sharp, watching the door, waiting for the wolf in gentleman's clothing to enter the fold. Dr. Charles Pemberton was a handsome man of 50, with silver hair and the confident bearing of a successful physician. He embraced his sister warmly, expressing concern and sympathy. But Miss Marple noticed how his eyes darted around the room, taking inventory, assessing. "Constance, my dear, I came as soon as I heard. Morrison telephoned me at dawn. This poor woman taking refuge here, claiming her husband wants to harm her. How perfectly dreadful for you." "It's been quite an ordeal," Mrs. Hartley said, her voice admirably steady despite her inner turmoil. "Mr. Ashcroft has been most helpful." Gerald stepped forward, offering his hand. Gerald Ashcroft, the supposed villain of the piece. Pemberton's handshake was firm, his smile practiced. "Dr. Charles Pemberton, forgive me, but you do look familiar. Have we met?" "I don't believe so," Gerald said smoothly, "though I'm told I have one of those faces." "Perhaps." Pemberton turned back to his sister. "Where is this unfortunate woman now?" "Still sleeping," Morrison said. "Yes, in the blue bedroom. She was quite exhausted." "I should examine her," Pemberton said immediately. "Given her mental state, it would be prudent to ensure she hasn't harmed herself. These cases can be quite unpredictable." Miss Marple's needles clicked faster. "How kind of you, Doctor! Though I'm not sure Mrs. Ashcroft would welcome a strange man in her bedroom." "I'm a physician, madam, and if she's as disturbed as Mr. Ashcroft suggests—" "I never said she was disturbed," Gerald interrupted quietly. "I said my wife believed I wanted to harm her. Quite a different thing." A flicker of something, alarm, calculation, crossed Pemberton's face. "Of course, my apologies. Nevertheless, I should like to speak with her. Professional curiosity, you understand." "I'll take you up," Mrs. Hartley said. "Jane, perhaps you'd come along, for propriety's sake." "Certainly, Guy dear." As they climbed the stairs, Miss Marple felt her pulse quicken. The blue bedroom was empty, of course, and when Dr. Pemberton discovered that fact, they would finally see his true nature revealed. The moment of truth was approaching, and Miss Marple knew with absolute certainty that before this day ended, there would indeed be blood on the floor. Chapter 7. Blood on the Floor. The corridor leading to the blue bedroom seemed longer than usual, each footstep echoing against the hardwood floors. Miss Marple walked beside Mrs. Hartley, whose face remained composed despite the trembling of her hands. Dr. Pemberton followed closely, Gerald Ashcroft bringing up the rear with careful deliberation. "I must say, Constance," Pemberton remarked conversationally, "your security here is rather lax. Anyone could simply walk in off the road. You really should consider better precautions, especially living so isolated." "I've always felt perfectly safe," Mrs. Hartley replied, her voice tight, "until recently." They reached the blue bedroom door. Mrs. Hartley's hand hesitated on the knob, and Miss Marple saw her take a steadying breath. Then she pushed it open. The room was empty. The bed remained neatly made, untouched from the previous day. No Vivian Ashcroft rested within. Dr. Pemberton's reaction was immediate and telling. His face, so carefully composed moments before, went rigid. His hand moved instinctively to his jacket pocket, and Miss Marple caught the glint of metal. A small pistol. "Where is she?" His voice had lost all its professional warmth, becoming cold and dangerous. "In police custody," Gerald said calmly, stepping into the doorway to block Pemberton's exit. "Along with her accomplice, Bobby Finch. They were arrested last night." Pemberton's hand tightened on the pistol, pulling it fully from his pocket. "You fool! You've ruined everything." He wasn't looking at Gerald, but at his sister. 3 months of planning, thousands of pounds in debt that needed to be paid, and you've destroyed it all. "Charles," Mrs. Hartley whispered, tears streaming down her face. "How could you? Your own sister." "My own sister, who inherited everything while I got nothing but father's debts." Pemberton's composure shattered completely. "You, with your manor house and your jewellery and your comfortable life, while I slave away in Harley Street trying to maintain appearances, drowning in gambling debts I can't pay. The people I owe money to aren't patient, Constance. They're not gentlemen. So you decided to rob me, to have me killed?" "Not killed," Pemberton said quickly, though the lie was transparent. "Just frightened enough to hand over some of the jewellery. That was the plan initially. But then Vivian suggested something more permanent, something that would solve all my problems at once." "And you agreed," Gerald said, his voice hard with contempt. "You're a doctor, sworn to preserve life, and you agreed to murder. Don't be naive. I'm a man drowning, and drowning men don't care who they pull down with them." Pemberton gestured with the pistol. "Now, all of you, back into the room, slowly." Miss Marple didn't move. "Dr. Pemberton, I wonder if you've considered that your accomplices may have already told the police everything? Vivian Cartwright isn't known for her loyalty under pressure. Vivian would never betray me. We had an arrangement." "Did you?" Miss Marple's tone was conversational, almost pleasant. "Then why did she never mention your name to us? Why was she planning to leave for France with only Bobby, leaving you behind to face your creditors?" Pemberton's face paled. "You're lying." "Am I?" "We overheard their conversation in the Folly last night. They spoke of the jewellery they'd steal, the money they'd already taken from Mr. Ashcroft's accounts, the boat to France. But they never mentioned you, Doctor. Not once. You were a tool to them, nothing more. Useful for information, but not worth including in their escape." The hand holding the pistol wavered slightly. "No, that's not. Vivian and I were partners. She promised." "What did she promise?" Gerald asked quietly. "Love? Loyalty? The same thing she promised me when she married me. Vivian Cartwright collects men the way other women collect jewellery, Dr. Pemberton. You were simply another mark." A sound of anguish escaped Pemberton's throat. For a moment, Miss Marple thought he might lower the pistol. But then his face hardened, and the weapon steadied again. "It doesn't matter now. None of it matters. Move into the room, all of you. I need time to think, to plan my next move." "There is no next move," Gerald said. "Inspector Craddock knows everything. He'll be here within the hour with a warrant for your arrest. Then I'll be gone before he arrives, but first, Pemberton's eyes fixed on his sister with terrible intensity. "First, I need insurance. Constance, you're going to open that safe of yours and give me the jewellery. All of it. Then I'll have enough to disappear. To start fresh somewhere the creditors can't find me. I won't help you escape justice, Charles." "You will if you want to live." Pemberton's finger tightened on the trigger. "Don't think I won't shoot. I've come too far to turn back now." Miss Marple's mind raced through possibilities. The pistol was old but functional, probably taken from the late Mr. Hartley's collection. Pemberton was desperate, which made him unpredictable. Gerald was positioned in the doorway, but too far away to act without being shot. She herself was elderly and unarmed, as was Mrs. Hartley. But Miss Marple had learned long ago that the greatest weapons were not physical. "Dr. Pemberton," she said calmly, "before you commit murder, in addition to conspiracy, perhaps you should know that Morrison is listening at the keyhole. He heard everything you just said." It was a gamble, a complete fabrication. But Pemberton's head snapped toward the door instinctively, and in that split second, Gerald lunged forward. The two men collided, struggling for the pistol. Mrs. Hartley screamed. Miss Marple grabbed her friend's arm, pulling her back against the wall. The gun discharged with a deafening crack, and plaster exploded from the ceiling. They wrestled across the room, crashing into the dresser. Gerald was younger and stronger, but Pemberton fought with the desperation of a cornered animal. Another shot fired, this time shattering the window. Cold morning air rushed into the room. "Charles, stop!" Mrs. Hartley cried. "Please!" But her brother was beyond reason. He brought his knee up viciously into Gerald's stomach. As Gerald doubled over, Pemberton wrenched the pistol free and staggered backward, panting. "I'm leaving," he gasped, "and if anyone follows me—" He never finished the sentence. Morrison appeared in the doorway, moving with surprising speed for his age, swinging a heavy brass candlestick. It connected with Pemberton's wrist with a solid crack. The doctor cried out in pain, and the pistol clattered to the floor. Gerald recovered instantly, tackling Pemberton to the ground. This time, the fight was brief. Within moments, Gerald had the doctor's arms pinned behind his back. "Morrison!" Miss Marple exclaimed. "I didn't actually expect you to be there." "I wasn't, miss," the butler replied, still gripping the candlestick. "But when I heard the first shot, I came running. Took me a moment to fetch this from the hall table." He looked down at the struggling Pemberton with disgust. "I've known this young man since he was in short pants. Never thought I'd see him come to this." The sound of motor-car engines announced the arrival of Inspector Craddock and his constables. Within minutes, Dr. Charles Pemberton was in handcuffs, still protesting his innocence even as the evidence condemned him. "The jewellery," he kept saying, even as they led him away. "I only needed the jewellery. None of this would have happened if she'd just given me the jewellery." After the police had departed, taking Pemberton with them, the 4 survivors of the ordeal gathered in the drawing room. Mrs. Hartley sat quietly weeping, her face buried in her hands. Morrison prepared tea with shaking hands. Gerald stood by the window, nursing bruised ribs. Miss Marple examined the damage to her cardigan, a loose thread where she'd been pulled against the wall during the struggle. As she worked to repair it, she noticed something on the floor near her chair. Blood. Just a few drops, but unmistakable. Gerald's blood, from a cut on his hand sustained during the fight. "Blood on the floor," she murmured quietly. "What was that, Jane?" Mrs. Hartley asked, looking up. "Nothing, dear. Just observing that the title of this particular story has finally revealed its meaning." Miss Marple smiled gently. "Though I must say, I'm relieved it wasn't more dramatic. A few drops from an honourable man's wound, rather than murder," Gerald finished grimly. "If Morrison hadn't arrived when he did—" "But he did," Miss Marple interrupted firmly. "That's what matters. Morrison, you were quite heroic." The elderly butler actually blushed. "Just doing my duty, miss. Couldn't let him harm Mrs. Hartley, could I? Not after 54 years of service." Mrs. Hartley rose and embraced her faithful servant, both of them quietly crying. Gerald looked away, giving them their privacy. "Miss Marple," he said quietly, "your bluff about Morrison listening at the door, that was remarkably brave, or remarkably foolish. If I hadn't been ready to act—" "But you were ready," Miss Marple said simply. "I've become quite good at reading people, Mr. Ashcroft. I knew you would seize the opportunity when it presented itself. Besides," she added with a slight smile, "in St. Mary Mead, one learns that desperate people always look toward the door when accused of being overheard. Human nature is wonderfully predictable." Inspector Craddock returned an hour later to take statements and inform them that Vivian Cartwright had, indeed, confessed everything once informed of Dr. Pemberton's arrest. The conspiracy was fully unravelled. 15 elderly victims across England over 3 years, nearly 80,000 stolen, and 2 deaths that had been ruled accidental but would now be reopened as murder investigations. "You've broken up quite a sophisticated operation," the inspector told them. "The Yard will want to speak with all of you, of course. But for now, I think you've earned your rest." As evening fell on Greenwood Manor, Miss Marple sat once more in her armchair by the fire, her knitting in her lap. The rain had begun again, gentler now, washing away the last traces of blood from the floorboards where Gerald had dripped as Morrison bound his injured hand. "Jane," Mrs. Hartley said softly, "how did you know?" "From the very beginning. How did you see through Vivian's performance?" Miss Marple considered the question carefully. "Because I've seen it all before, dear. In St. Mary Mead, in smaller ways perhaps, but human nature remains constant. The grieving widow who murdered her husband, the devoted daughter who was slowly poisoning her mother, the respectable businessman who was embezzling from the church fund, they all tell the same kinds of lies, make the same kinds of mistakes. It seems such a dark view of humanity." "On the contrary," Miss Marple said, her eyes twinkling. "For every villain, there are dozens of good people. People like Morrison, who risked his life for his employer. People like Mr. Ashcroft, who dedicated months to bringing criminals to justice. And people like you, dear Constance, who opened your home to a stranger in need, even at risk to yourself." She resumed her knitting, the needles clicking steadily in the firelight. Outside, the rain continued its eternal song against the windows, no longer menacing, but merely rain, washing the world clean for another day. Chapter 8. Secrets and Confessions. 3 days had passed since Dr. Pemberton's arrest, and an uneasy peace had settled over Greenwood Manor. The broken window had been boarded up temporarily, awaiting the glazier from the village. The police had concluded their investigations, having collected statements, examined evidence, and departed with assurances that Mrs. Hartley would be kept informed of the proceedings. Miss Marple had originally planned to return to St. Mary Mead the day after the incident, but Constance had begged her to stay, and she had agreed. Her friend was still fragile, shaken by her brother's betrayal, in ways that went deeper than physical danger. On this particular afternoon, Miss Marple found herself in the conservatory, tending to Mrs. Hartley's orchids, while their owner rested upstairs. The delicate flowers required careful attention. Too much water would kill them as surely as too little. Rather like people, Miss Marple reflected. Miss Marple? She turned to find Gerald Ashcroft standing in the doorway, his hand still bandaged from the struggle. He'd taken rooms at the Golden Pheasant, but had called at the manor each day, ostensibly to check on Mrs. Hartley's welfare. "Mr. Ashcroft, do come in. I was just admiring these phalaenopsis. Quite beautiful, aren't they?" "I'm afraid I know nothing about flowers," Gerald admitted, stepping into the warm, humid air of the conservatory. "Miss Marple, I wonder if I might speak with you privately?" "Of course." She set down her watering can and gestured to a small wrought-iron bench. "Shall we sit?" Gerald remained standing, pacing restlessly among the plants. "I haven't been entirely truthful with you. About my investigation, about my marriage to Vivienne." "I suspected as much," Miss Marple said mildly. "Would you care to enlighten me now?" He stopped pacing and faced her directly. "I wasn't investigating Vivienne on behalf of any client. It was personal. 3 years ago, she swindled my mother out of nearly everything she had. My mother was a widow, living alone in Brighton. Vivienne befriended her, gained her trust, convinced her to make certain investments. By the time I discovered what was happening, my mother had lost her home, her savings, everything." "I'm very sorry," Miss Marple said softly. "What happened to your mother?" "She died 6 months later. The doctors said it was heart failure, but I know better. She died of a broken heart, of shame and humiliation." Gerald's voice was raw. "I couldn't prove Vivienne had done anything illegal. She'd been too clever, covered her tracks too well. So I became obsessed with bringing her to justice. I trained as a private detective, tracked her movements, documented her crimes. And then, when I'd learned enough about her methods, I decided to marry her." "To trap her," Miss Marple observed. "Yes. I thought if I could get close to her, live with her, I'd find the evidence I needed. I'd make her pay for what she did to my mother." He laughed bitterly. "Instead, I found myself, complicated by the situation." "You developed feelings for her." Gerald looked away. "How could I? How could I feel anything for a woman who destroyed my mother's life? But she was so different when we were alone. Vulnerable, sometimes. She talked about her childhood, how she'd grown up in poverty, how she'd learned early that the world was cruel to those without money or beauty. I started to see her as a victim herself in a way. Until you found the letters from Bobby Finch. Yes, that reminded me of what she really was. A criminal, a predator, someone who chose to hurt others rather than make an honest life." He turned back to Miss Marple. "But I still wonder, sometimes, if any of it was real. If any part of the woman I thought I knew actually existed." Miss Marple considered this carefully. "Mr. Ashcroft, in my experience, people are rarely entirely one thing or another. Vivienne Cartwright is a criminal, yes, but that doesn't mean every moment she shared with you was a lie. People contain multitudes, both darkness and light. The tragedy is when they choose to follow the darkness." "Do you think she felt anything real for me?" "I think," Miss Marple said gently, "that's a question only she can answer, and perhaps one you shouldn't ask for your own peace of mind." Gerald nodded slowly. "Inspector Craddock told me she's asking to see me. Before they transfer her to London for trial, I don't know if I should go." "That depends on what you hope to gain from such a meeting. Closure? Answers? Revenge? I don't know." He sat down heavily on the bench beside her. "I spent 8 months married to a woman who may have been acting the entire time. How do I move forward from that?" "The same way anyone moves forward from heartbreak," Miss Marple said practically. "One day at a time, with the understanding that you're older and wiser for the experience. You helped bring a dangerous criminal to justice, Mr. Ashcroft. You should take some satisfaction in that." Before Gerald could respond, Morrison appeared in the conservatory doorway. "Excuse me, miss, but there's a young lady asking to see Mr. Ashcroft, a Miss Sarah Pemberton. She says it's urgent." Gerald frowned. "Pemberton? Is she related to Dr. Pemberton's daughter?" Morrison confirmed. "She's quite distressed." They found Sarah Pemberton in the drawing room, a young woman of perhaps 25, with her father's dark hair, but none of his cold calculation in her eyes. She rose when they entered, twisting a handkerchief in her hands. "Mr. Ashcroft, I'm Sarah Pemberton. I know I shouldn't come here, but I had to speak with you, and with Mrs. Hartley, if she'll see me." "I'm not sure that's wise," Gerald began, but Miss Marple interrupted. "Let's hear what she has to say. Mrs. Hartley is resting, but I can listen on her behalf. Please sit down, my dear." Sarah sank back onto the sofa, tears already streaming down her face. "I came to apologize, to beg forgiveness for what my father did. I had no idea. I swear I had no idea he was involved in anything criminal. I thought his financial troubles were just bad luck, poor investments." "You knew about his debts?" Gerald asked. "Only recently. 6 months ago, some men came to our house in London. Horrible men threatening my father. That's when I learned he'd been gambling, that he owed money to dangerous people. I offered to help. I have a small inheritance from my grandmother, but he refused, said he'd handle it his own way." Fresh tears fell. "I never imagined his way would be this." Miss Marple studied the young woman with sympathetic eyes. "Miss Pemberton, you're not responsible for your father's choices." "But Aunt Constance, she's my aunt too, you see. My father's sister. I've always loved her. Summer holidays here at Greenwood Manor were the happiest times of my childhood. And to think he planned to rob her, to perhaps even—" She couldn't finish the sentence. "Does your mother know?" Miss Marple asked gently. "My mother died when I was 12. It's been just father and me since then." Sarah looked up, her face anguished. "What will happen to him? Will he hang?" "That's for the courts to decide," Gerald said, not unkindly. "But given that no one was actually murdered in this particular incident, and that he cooperated with the police about the other cases, he may face life imprisonment rather than execution." "Life in prison?" Sarah closed her eyes. "It's what he deserves, I know, but he's still my father. How do I reconcile loving him with hating what he's done?" Miss Marple reached over and patted the young woman's hand. "You don't need to reconcile it, dear. Love and disappointment can exist side by side. You can grieve for the father you thought you had while accepting the man he actually is." Mrs. Hartley appeared in the doorway, looking pale but composed. "Sarah? Is that you?" "Aunt Constance!" Sarah leapt up, rushing to her aunt. "I'm so sorry, so terribly sorry." Constance embraced her niece, both women crying. "Hush, child! You have nothing to apologize for, nothing at all." They clung to each other, finding comfort in shared grief. Miss Marple exchanged glances with Gerald, and they quietly withdrew, leaving the two women their privacy. In the corridor, Gerald spoke quietly. "Thank you, Miss Marple, for what you said to her, and to me. I simply spoke the truth as I see it. Human beings are complicated creatures, Mr. Ashcroft. We're all capable of both great kindness and terrible cruelty. The measure of a person is which path they choose when faced with difficult circumstances. And what path do you think I should choose? Regarding Vivian? Miss Marple considered. I think you should go see her. Not for her sake, but for yours. You need to close that chapter of your life before you can begin a new one. Whatever she tells you, whatever you learn, at least you'll know. Uncertainty is often more poisonous than painful truth. Gerald nodded slowly. You're right, I'll go tomorrow. But after that, I think I'll leave detective work behind. Find some other purpose for my life. A wise decision. Though I suspect you'll always have that investigative mind, it's simply part of who you are now. Miss Marple smiled. Perhaps you might write about your experiences. Detective fiction is quite popular these days, though do change the names to protect the innocent. And the guilty? Especially the guilty. They have lawyers, after all. Gerald laughed. The first genuine laughter Miss Marple had heard from him since the night they'd met. It was a good sound, suggesting that perhaps healing was possible after all. That evening, as Miss Marple sat with Mrs. Hartley and Sarah by the fire, she reflected on the strange interconnectedness of human lives. A man's gambling debts had set in motion a chain of events that touched so many lives. Vivian Cartwright, Bobby Finch, Gerald Ashcroft's mother, the 15 victims across England, and now Sarah Pemberton, an innocent woman forced to reckon with her father's crimes. Jane, Mrs. Hartley said quietly, Sarah will be staying with me for a while. She has no other family, and I think we need each other right now. A splendid idea, Miss Marple approved. Family is what we make of it, not always what we're born into. Sarah looked up from her teacup, gratitude shining in her eyes. Thank you, Aunt Constance. Thank you, Miss Marple. You've both been so kind when you had every right to turn me away. Nonsense, Miss Marple said briskly. The sins of the father should not be visited upon the daughter. Besides, your aunt will need help managing this estate, especially with Morrison getting older. It seems to me you might be just what Greenwood Manor needs. As the three women sat together in companionable silence, the fire crackling and the rain beginning once more against the windows, Miss Marple thought about the nature of justice and redemption. Dr. Pemberton would face the consequences of his actions. Vivian Cartwright and Bobby Finch would spend years in prison. But Sarah and Mrs. Hartley would rebuild, creating something good from the wreckage of betrayal. And Gerald Ashcroft would finally lay his mother's memory to rest, finding closure at last. Not all stories ended happily, Miss Marple knew, but some, at least, ended with the possibility of healing. And that, she reflected, was perhaps the best one could hope for in this imperfect world. Chapter 9. The Final Interview. The county prison was a grim Victorian structure of grey stone and barred windows, standing like a monument to human failure on the outskirts of the market town. Gerald Ashcroft stood outside its gates for several minutes before summoning the courage to enter. Miss Marple's words echoing in his mind, "You need to close that chapter of your life." The visiting room was sparse and cheerless, with whitewashed walls and a long table. Divided by a metal grill, Gerald sat on one side, his hands clasped tightly together, waiting. He'd told the guards he was Vivian's husband, which was technically true. Though the word felt hollow in his mouth, the door on the opposite side opened, and Vivian Cartwright entered, flanked by a matron. She wore the plain grey dress of a prisoner awaiting trial, her dark hair pulled back severely from her face. Without her fashionable clothes and careful makeup, she looked younger, more vulnerable, but her violet eyes were as sharp as ever. "Gerald." She sat down across from him, the matron taking a position by the door. "I wasn't sure you'd come." "Neither was I," he admitted. For a long moment, they simply looked at each other across the divide, literal and metaphorical, that separated them. "They tell me you're the reason I was caught," Vivian said finally. "That you married me specifically to investigate me. Is that true?" "Yes." She absorbed this, her expression unreadable. "How long have you known about what I do?" "3 years, since you swindled my mother in Brighton." Gerald's voice was steady, but his eyes betrayed his pain. "She died because of what you did to her. She lost everything, her home, her dignity, her will to live." Vivian's face went pale. "Mrs. Ashcroft was your mother?" "Oh, God! Gerald, I didn't know. Would it have mattered if you had?" The question hung in the air between them. Vivian looked down at her hands, and for the first time since he'd met her, Gerald saw genuine shame cross her features. "Probably not," she whispered. "Not then. I am what I am, Gerald. I learned early that survival meant taking what you could get. That sentiment was a luxury for people who could afford it." "You told me about your childhood," Gerald said. "The poverty, the abuse. Was any of that true, or was it all part of the performance?" "It was true." Vivian looked up, meeting his eyes. "Every word. My father drank away what little money we had. My mother died when I was 14, and I was left to fend for myself. I learned quickly that pretty girls who knew how to talk and charm could eat better than those who didn't." She paused. "But I know that doesn't excuse what I became, what I chose to do. Why did you do it? You're intelligent, educated. You could have made an honest living." "Could I?" Vivian's laugh was bitter. "With what references? What family connections? I tried, Gerald. I really did, at first. But respectable jobs for women like me paid barely enough to survive, and I'd learned to want more than survival. I wanted security, comfort, the things other people took for granted." "So you decided to steal them?" "Yes." No excuses now, just flat acknowledgement. "I justified it by telling myself I only took from people who had more than they needed. That made it easier to sleep at night. Until your mother." Gerald leaned forward. "What was different about her?" "She was kind to me, genuinely kind. Not because she wanted something or because I was charming her, but just because that's who she was." Vivian's voice broke. "I remember thinking, even as I was taking her money, that I wished I'd had a mother like her, someone who saw good in people. And then I took everything from her anyway, because that's what I do. That's what I've always done. Do you regret it? Would it matter if I did? Would it bring her back? Would it undo any of the harm I've caused?" Vivian wiped at her eyes with the back of her hand. "But yes, Gerald. For what it's worth, I regret it. I regret a lot of things." "Do you regret marrying me?" The question surprised her. She studied his face for a long moment before answering. "That's complicated. I knew something was wrong from the beginning. You were too perfect, too interested, too persistent. Most of my marks were easy to manipulate, but you never quite were. I should have run then, but what? But I was tired, Gerald. Tired of running, tired of lying, tired of being alone. Bobby was planning this job, the Greenwood Manor job, and he promised it would be the last one, that we'd have enough money to disappear, to start over somewhere new. And I thought, maybe with Bobby, I could finally stop. She laughed bitterly. Stupid, wasn't it? Bobby would never have stopped. He loved the thrill too much. And Dr. Pemberton? Charles was Bobby's contact. Bobby had worked as a chauffeur for wealthy families before, and he'd met Charles at some gentlemen's club. Charles provided the information. Who had what? Who was vulnerable when properties would be empty? We paid him a percentage. Vivian's expression hardened. I never liked him. He was doing it all for money, without any of the desperation that drove me or the excitement that drove Bobby. He was just greedy, plain and simple. He's been arrested, along with Bobby. You've all been charged with conspiracy, fraud, and attempted murder. I know. The prosecutor was here yesterday. He says I'm looking at 15 years minimum, possibly more. Vivian met Gerald's eyes. I'm going to cooperate fully. Tell them everything about all the jobs, all the victims. It won't undo what I've done, but maybe it will help some of the families get closure. That's unexpected. Is it? I've lost everything, Gerald. My freedom, my future, any chance at the life I dreamed of having. The least I can do is tell the truth now. She paused. There's something else I need to tell you. About our marriage. Gerald tensed. What about it? Some of it was real. The words came out in a rush. Not at first. At first, I was trying to figure out your angle, trying to stay ahead of whatever game you were playing. But somewhere along the way, I started to care. Really care. Those mornings when we'd have breakfast together and you'd read the newspaper aloud to me, or those evenings when we'd walk through Hyde Park, those were real for me, Gerald. Maybe the only real things I've had in years. How am I supposed to believe that? After everything, you're not, Vivian interrupted. You're not supposed to believe it, because why would you? I've lied about everything else, but I'm telling you anyway, because you deserve to know that not every moment was a con, that the woman you thought you knew kind of existed, just buried under too many years of lies and survival and selfishness to ever really come to the surface. Gerald felt something break inside him, not his heart exactly, but something close to it. The anger he'd carried for 3 years, the drive for revenge that had consumed him, suddenly felt exhausted, used up. What happens now? He asked quietly. I go to trial. I'm convicted. I spend the next 15 or 20 years in prison if I'm lucky enough not to hang. Vivian's voice was matter-of-fact. And you go back to your life and try to forget you ever knew me. I don't think I can forget you. Then remember me as a lesson about what happens when people make wrong choices, when they let circumstances define them instead of fighting to be better. She stood, signaling to the matron that the visit was over. Goodbye, Gerald. Thank you for coming. And I'm sorry, truly sorry, about your mother. I know that doesn't fix anything, but I needed to say it. Gerald stood as well, watching as she turned to leave. Vivian, she paused, looking back, I hope you find some peace eventually, even in prison. I hope you find a way to forgive yourself. Her smile was sad and small. That's more than I deserve from you, but thank you. Then she was gone, the door closing behind her with a definitive clang. Gerald sat back down, suddenly exhausted. The matron discreetly looked away as he put his head in his hands, not quite crying but close to it. He'd gotten what he came for. Closure, answers, some kind of understanding. But he hadn't expected to feel this emptiness, this peculiar grief for something that had never quite been real, but hadn't been entirely false either. After several minutes, he composed himself and left the prison. Outside, the autumn air was crisp and clean. and he found Miss Marple waiting by his car, knitting in hand despite the cold. "Miss Marple, what are you doing here?" "Mrs. Hartley was kind enough to let Morrison drive me into town. I thought you might appreciate some company for the drive back." She examined his face with those sharp, knowing eyes. "How did it go?" "I'm not entirely sure," Gerald admitted. "She apologized. She claimed some of what we had was real. I don't know if I believe her." "Does it matter whether you believe her?" Gerald considered this as he opened the car door for her. "I suppose not. Real or not, it's over now." "Not quite over," Miss Marple corrected gently as they drove away from the prison. "Healing takes time, Mr. Ashcroft, but I think you've taken the first step today. You've faced the past instead of running from it." They drove in comfortable silence for several miles before Gerald spoke again. "Miss Marple, in all your years of observing human nature, do you believe people can truly change? Can someone like Vivian ever become genuinely good?" Miss Marple was quiet for a long moment, her knitting needles clicking softly. "I believe people can change, yes, but it requires tremendous effort and a genuine desire to be different. Most people find it easier to remain as they are, even when being as they are causes suffering." She glanced at him. "But occasionally, very occasionally, circumstances force people to confront who they've become, and they choose to change. Whether Mrs. Ashcroft is capable of that, only time will tell." "I find myself hoping she is," Gerald said quietly. "Is that foolish of me?" "Not foolish, human. Hope is what separates us from the criminals we pursue, Mr. Ashcroft. Never lose that." As they approached Greenwood Manor, the sun broke through the clouds for the first time in days, casting golden light across the autumn countryside. Gerald felt something shift inside him. Not happiness exactly, but perhaps the beginning of acceptance. The chapter, as Miss Marple had said, was finally closed. What came next was up to him. Chapter 10. Return to St. Mary Mead. A week had passed since Gerald's visit to the prison, and autumn had truly settled over the English countryside. The leaves had turned brilliant shades of amber and crimson, and there was a sharpness to the morning air that spoke of winter's approach. Miss Marple stood in the entrance hall of Greenwood Manor, her modest travelling case at her feet, preparing to return to St. Mary Mead. "Must you really go, Jane?" Mrs. Hartley asked, though she knew the answer. "You've become such a fixture here these past 2 weeks. All the more reason to leave before I overstay my welcome," Miss Marple said with a gentle smile. "Besides, my own garden needs attention, and I'm sure there are countless village matters requiring my observation." Sarah Pemberton descended the stairs, looking considerably more composed than when she'd first arrived. "Miss Marple, I wanted to thank you before you left, for everything you said to me about not bearing my father's guilt. My dear child, I spoke only the truth. You've been a tremendous help to your aunt this past week. I'm certain Greenwood Manor will thrive with you here. I hope so." Sarah glanced at her aunt with genuine affection. "It feels like coming home in a way. Being here again, remembering the good times before everything became so complicated." Morrison appeared with Miss Marple's coat and hat. "The motor car is ready whenever you are, miss. I'll be driving you to the station myself." "How kind, Morrison, though I do hope you haven't polished the brass candlestick too much. It should bear its battle scars with pride." The elderly butler actually chuckled. "Indeed, miss. Mrs. Hartley has suggested we display it in the entrance hall with a small plaque for extraordinary service." As Miss Marple prepared to depart, Gerald Ashcroft arrived, having come to say his own goodbyes. He'd spent the past week making arrangements to close up his affairs in London, and had decided, somewhat surprisingly, to take rooms in the village for the winter. "I thought I might try my hand at that writing you suggested," he explained to Miss Marple. "The village inn has rooms available, and the landlord assures me it's quiet enough for concentration." "How splendid," Miss Marple approved. "Though I should warn you, country villages are never quite as quiet as outsiders expect. There's always some drama or another. After the past 2 weeks, I think I can handle village drama," Gerald said with a wry smile. Then, more seriously, "Miss Marple, I wanted to thank you for your wisdom, your kindness, and most importantly, for preventing me from becoming as consumed by vengeance as I might have been." "You prevented that yourself, Mr. Ashcroft. I merely provided a listening ear." She paused, adjusting her gloves. "Have you heard anything further about the trial?" "It's set for January. Inspector Craddock tells me that with Vivian's cooperation, they've managed to locate several more victims and recover some stolen property. It won't undo the damage, but it's something." "And Dr. Pemberton?" Gerald's expression darkened. "He's maintaining his innocence, claiming Vivian and Bobby acted without his knowledge, but the evidence is overwhelming. He'll be convicted." Sarah, who'd been listening quietly, spoke up. "I've written to him. I don't know if he'll read my letters, but I needed to tell him that I'll visit him, even after conviction. He's still my father, even if I can never forgive what he's done." "That takes remarkable strength," Miss Marple said warmly, "both loving someone and holding them accountable for their actions. You're a wise young woman, Miss Pemberton." The time for departure arrived all too soon. Mrs. Hartley embraced Miss Marple tightly, tears in her eyes. "You saved my life, Jane, in more ways than one." "Nonsense! Morrison saved your life with that candlestick. I merely asked the right questions." But she returned the embrace fondly. "You'll write to me, won't you? Let me know how you're getting on." "Every week," Mrs. Hartley promised. The drive to the station was peaceful, the countryside rolling past in waves of autumn colour. Morrison drove carefully, his old hand steady on the wheel. "Morrison," Miss Marple said as they neared the village, "may I ask you something rather personal?" "Of course, miss." "When you struck Dr. Pemberton with that candlestick, you knew exactly what you were doing, didn't you? The angle, the force required." Morrison was quiet for a moment. "I served in the Boer War, miss, long before I came to Greenwood Manor. One learns certain things in war that one never quite forgets, even after 50 years of peaceful service." "I thought as much. You're a remarkable man, Morrison." "Just an old butler who loves his employer, miss. Nothing remarkable about that." At the station, Morrison insisted on carrying her case to the platform. The London train was just pulling in, steam billowing into the crisp air. "Thank you, Morrison, for everything. It was my honour, Miss Marple. Do come visit again, perhaps under less dramatic circumstances." "I rather hope so," Miss Marple agreed. "Though in my experience, drama has a way of finding me regardless of my intentions." The train journey back to St. Mary Mead gave Miss Marple time to reflect on the extraordinary events of the past 2 weeks. She thought of Vivian Cartwright, sitting in her prison cell, finally facing the consequences of years of deception. She thought of Dr. Pemberton, his arrogance and greed leading to the destruction of everything he'd worked for. She thought of Gerald Ashcroft, carrying the weight of his mother's death. but finally beginning to heal. And she thought of Sarah and Constance, two women creating a family from the ruins of betrayal. Rain on the window, blood on the floor. The title that had seemed so ominous had proven prophetic, though not in the way anyone might have expected. The rain had washed away secrets, and the blood had marked the moment when truth finally prevailed over deception. The train pulled into St. Mary Mead Station, just as the church bells were striking 4 o'clock. Miss Marple gathered her things and stepped onto the familiar platform. Breathing in the scent of home, wood smoke, autumn leaves, and the faint aroma of fresh bread from the bakery. "Miss Marple, you're back!" She turned to find Mrs. Dolly Bantry hurrying toward her, fairly bursting with curiosity. "We heard you were caught up in some sort of criminal matter. A murder plot, someone said. You must tell me everything." "Goodness, Dolly, news travels fast. Though I should correct you, there was no actual murder, thankfully. Just an attempted robbery that was prevented. But there was a gun and a struggle. Mrs. Harmon heard it from her cousin, who lives near Greenwood Manor." Miss Marple allowed herself to be led toward Mrs. Bantry's waiting car, knowing that the next hour would be spent in careful explanation, editing out the most sensitive details while satisfying her friend's insatiable curiosity. This was the price of living in a village. Privacy was a luxury no one truly possessed. That evening, settled back in her own cottage with a cup of tea and her knitting, Miss Marple found herself at peace. Through her window, she could see the lights of St. Mary Mead twinkling in the gathering dusk. Mrs. Price Ridley was walking her terrier. The vicar was hurrying toward the church for evening service. Young Tommy Bond was cycling home from his cricket practice. Ordinary life, peaceful and predictable. Yet Miss Marple knew that beneath this tranquil surface, human nature remained constant, capable of both tremendous good and terrible evil, of sacrifice and selfishness, of love and betrayal. A knock at her door interrupted her thoughts. She opened it to find Inspector Slack from the local constabulary, looking rather sheepish. "Evening, Miss Marple. I heard you were back. Thought I'd drop by to say that Inspector Craddock from the county police telephoned. He wanted me to pass along his compliments on your work solving the Greenwood Manor case." "How kind of him, though I hardly solved it alone." "Still, he said you saw through that Cartwright woman from the very beginning. Said you've got instincts that would put most trained detectives to shame." Inspector Slack shifted uncomfortably. "I wanted to say, I'm sorry for the times that I've dismissed your observations as village gossip. You've a real talent for seeing what others miss." "Thank you, Inspector. That's very gracious of you." Miss Marple paused. "Though I suspect you'll be back to dismissing my observations within a fortnight. It's the natural order of things." Slack actually smiled. "You're probably right. But for now, I'll admit you're quite good at this detective business." After he left, Miss Marple returned to her chair by the window. She picked up her knitting, a soft blue cardigan for her great-nephew, nearly finished now, and resumed the familiar rhythm. The rain began again, gentle and steady, pattering against the windows of her cottage. But unlike the ominous storm that had brought Vivian Cartwright to Greenwood Manor, this rain felt cleansing, peaceful. Miss Marple thought about all of the people whose lives had been touched by this case. Some, like Vivian and Dr. Pemberton, would face years of punishment for their choices. Others, like Gerald and Sarah, would carry scars, but also the possibility of healing. And still others, like Constance and Morrison, would continue their quiet lives with a deeper appreciation for loyalty and courage. As for herself, Miss Marple was simply grateful to be home, surrounded by the familiar rhythms of village life. She knew that evil existed in the world. She'd seen too much of it to believe otherwise. But she also knew that goodness persisted, often in the smallest acts of kindness and courage. Outside, the rain continued its eternal song. Inside, Miss Marple's needles clicked steadily, creating something useful and warm from simple wool and patience. It was, she reflected, not such a bad metaphor for life itself, taking the threads we're given and creating something worthwhile, stitch by careful stitch. Tomorrow there would be the church bazaar committee meeting, and she'd heard rumours that the new doctor in the village was behaving rather mysteriously. Mrs. Harmon's nephew had returned from London under suspicious circumstances, and there was talk of missing money from the church restoration fund. Miss Marple smiled to herself. St. Mary Mead was never truly quiet for long. There would always be another puzzle, another mystery, another opportunity to observe human nature in all its complicated glory. But tonight, she was simply content to sit by her fire, knitting and watching the rain wash the world clean outside her window. The case of the blood on the floor was closed, but life, with all its endless complications and surprises, continued on. And Miss Jane Marple, keen observer of human nature, wouldn't have it any other way. The end.